Every town has its secrets, but some places hide them too well. On the edge of a forgotten street, there's an old hotel, its walls crumbling, its rooms nearly empty. Travelers avoid it, except for the desperate or the unlucky Dot. And at the very end of the 6th floor lies a door you should never open. Behind it is room 6A. For years, whispers have spread about the woman who vanished there, about the phone that keeps ringing, and about the warning voice that echoes at exactly 3 a.m. tonight. You will hear the story of room 6A, and the last call that no one should ever answer. Pause. Then lower, chilling tone, because once you do, it's already too late. On the edge of a forgotten town, where the streets seemed to lead nowhere, and the air carried the scent of rain-soaked concrete and rust, there stood an old hotel. Its brick walls were cracked, its neon sign half broken, flickering weakly with the letters barely visible through decades of dust. Locals called it the Hollow Inn, though no one could remember when it had last been filled with life. The lobby smelled of damp carpets, cigarette smoke, and a kind of sadness that clung to the wallpaper like mold. Few travelers ever stopped there anymore. Those who did were often drifters, truckers too tired to keep driving, or lost souls looking for shelter where no one asked questions. The front desk was always manned by an older clerk with a tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Behind him, the key rack hung heavy with brass keys, each tag etched with room numbers that most people never touched. But among them, one number stood out: 6A. Guests would sometimes notice the key, its brass surface darkened with age, hanging at the very edge of the rack. The clerk's hand never reached for it unless forced, and if a guest ever dared to ask for that particular room, a shadow of unease would cross his face. He would clear his throat, pretend to search for another key, and gently suggest a different room. Sometimes he would even lie, saying, "Sorry, that one's under repair." Everyone in town knew that room 6A was different. Stories swirled among the local stories about cries in the middle of the night, shadows crawling under the door, and a phone that would not stay silent. Children dared each other to stand at the end of the 6th-floor hallway and listen. Some swore they heard faint ringing. Others claimed to hear whispers carried through the vents. The strangest thing was that no one could remember when it started. There was no single incident that townsfolk pointed to, no official record of a death, a crime, or a tragedy. And yet, everyone avoided speaking of it directly, as if the mere mention of room 6A was enough to invite something dark into the conversation. The hotel itself felt like it wanted to swallow its own history. Curtains stayed closed even during the day. The lights in the hallway dimmed no matter how many bulbs were replaced, and the air on the 6th floor always seemed colder than anywhere else in the building. Travelers described it as a silence that pressed down on their chest, making them feel watched even when no one was there. It was in this place, half abandoned, half forgotten, that the legend of room 6A began. A story whispered between locals, ignored by the owners, and yet impossible to erase. For while the rest of the hotel aged quietly, room 6A remained alive with something else, something unseen, something waiting. It was a stormy night when she arrived, rain slashing against the broken glass doors of the hotel, thunder rolling across the empty streets like the growl of something ancient. The woman came alone, dragging behind her a small, battered suitcase whose wheels squeaked with every step. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, but her face carried an exhaustion that went deeper than sleepless nights. Her hair was damp, sticking to her cheeks, and her eyes darted around the lobby as though she expected something or someone to follow her inside. The clerk behind the desk noticed the tremor in her hands when she filled out the guest register. He asked if she had a preference for a room, already expecting her to request something on the lower floors, close to the exits like most weary travelers did. But her answer froze him. "Room 6A, please." His pen nearly slipped from his fingers. For a moment, he just stared at her, his throat dry, his pulse quickening with the unease that locals never spoke aloud. "I'm afraid that room isn't available," he murmured, rehearsing the excuse he had used countless times before. Plumbing issues. Perhaps she cut him off with a sharp, desperate tone. "No, I need 6A." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a fleeting second, he saw tears glisten in her eyes. Whatever haunted that woman, it was clear she believed the only place she could hide was behind that cursed door. Reluctantly, he handed her the brass key. It was heavier than it should have been, the tag cold against her skin. She clenched it tightly, as if it were a lifeline. Without another word, she wheeled her suitcase toward the rickety elevator. the doors groaning open as though the building itself objected. Later that night, long after she had locked herself inside, the clerk heard the sound. The old landline phone at the desk buzzed with a faint connection. He lifted the receiver, only to hear muffled sobs on the other end. The voice was fragile, broken. "Please, don't let them in. Please, I can hear them outside the door." Then came the scream so sharp, it rattled the receiver in his hand. The line went dead, heart racing. He rushed upstairs with the night guard. They banged on the door to room 6A, shouting for the woman. Silence answered. With shaking hands, the clerk unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The suitcase was gone. The only thing left was the old landline phone, the receiver dangling off the hook, swinging gently as if someone had just set it down. The woman was never seen again, and from that night forward, room 6A was no longer just another hotel room. It became a warning. For weeks after the woman vanished, the hotel tried to move on as if nothing had happened. The staff avoided speaking of it. The front desk clerk refused to mention her stay, and room 6A was quietly locked. Yet, despite their silence, something lingered on the 6th floor, something that refused to be forgotten. It began subtly, like a trick of the years. Guests in the rooms neighboring 6A, 6B, and 6C complained of faint noises at night. At first, they thought it was the old pipes moaning through the walls, or the wind dragging itself through cracks in the broken windows. But the sound grew sharper, more distinct. It was the unmistakable ringing of a landline phone. One guest, a traveling salesman, swore he woke at 3 a.m. to the shrill metallic chime of an old rotary phone, muffled yet persistent, as though it were ringing from just beyond his wall. Groggy and irritated, he pressed his ear against the plaster and froze. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside room 6A. The next morning, he confronted the desk clerk, demanding to know why the staff hadn't disconnected the phone if the room was out of use. The clerk paled, stammered, and swore that no phone line was active there. The guest left the hotel that same day, abandoning a paid reservation. Others reported similar experiences. Some described the sound as faint, distant, like a memory bleeding through the walls. Others swore it was deafening, rattling their doors and pulling them out of nightmares. A few guests even claimed that when they picked up their own cell phones to check the time, the screen flickered as if an invisible call was trying to come through. Housekeeping staff refused to step onto the 6th floor alone. They whispered that sometimes, while vacuuming the hallway, they heard the soft click of a receiver being lifted, followed by a woman's faint sobs echoing down the corridor. But when they knocked, no one answered, and if they dared open the door with the master key, the room was always empty. What unsettled them most was how the ringing seemed to obey its own rhythm, as if it had a schedule. Night after night, it came back, always around the same time, 3 a.m., the witching hour, a time when the world is at its thinnest, when the living and the dead are said to brush shoulders. The staff tried to ignore it. They told themselves it was faulty wiring, a trick of memory, or simply tired minds imagining what they feared. But deep down, they knew better. The ringing wasn't random. It wasn't mechanical. It was a call, and whoever or whatever was on the other end was waiting for someone to answer. The ringing of the phone in room 6A should have been impossible. The hotel's landline system had been shut down years earlier, its tangled wires left to rot behind cracked plaster walls. Yet, night after night, the sound persisted, shrill, insistent, and cold. Guests who complained were brushed off with nervous excuses, but the truth could no longer be ignored. Something inside 6A was reaching out. Then the calls began. It started with a young couple traveling cross-country. Exhausted, they booked a room near the 6th floor, not knowing its history. At precisely 3 a.m., the husband's cell phone lit up on the nightstand. He found no caller ID, just a blank screen. Against his wife's protests, he answered. For several seconds there was nothing but static, a low hiss like wind rushing through a tunnel. Then came the faint voice of a woman, trembling, broken. "Please, don't let them in." His blood ran cold. He whispered back, asking who it was, but the voice repeated the warning, growing more desperate until the line went dead. Seconds later, the phone rang again and again. When he finally threw it across the room, the sound of ringing continued, echoing through the darkened walls, as if every phone in the building had come alive. They checked out before dawn, pale and silent, refusing to speak of what they had heard. They were not the last. Others soon reported the same phenomenon. Businessmen, tourists, Even locals who had come out of morbid curiosity all claimed to have been woken at 3 a.m. by phantom calls. Some described the same trembling female voice, pleading with them not to open the door. Others swore they heard sobs, heavy breathing, or distorted laughter that seemed to crawl beneath their skin. One terrified guest insisted the voice on the line began as a woman, but shifted mid-sentence into something deeper, guttural, inhuman. And no matter where the call was traced, it always led back to the same source, room 6A. The strangest detail was how the calls felt personal. The voice often whispered the listener's name, even when they had never given it to the hotel. A woman once claimed the voice recited a secret from her past, something only she and her late husband would have known. Another man fled screaming after the caller described what he was wearing, down to the color of his socks. Despite being alone in his locked room, the staff stopped answering phones altogether. Some refused to work the night shift, swearing that the old switchboard lights still flickered as if lines were being connected, even though the system had been cut. The manager threatened to fire anyone who spread ghost stories to the guests, but his trembling hands and sleepless eyes betrayed him. He, too, had heard the ringing by then. The legend of the woman from room 6A had transformed into something darker. She wasn't just gone, she was reaching out, trapped between worlds, her voice echoing across dead wires, warning anyone who would listen. But warnings are only useful if someone believes them, and most who received the call were too paralyzed with fear to act. That's when the disappearances began. It was on a rain-soaked evening when he arrived, a middle-aged businessman, tall, sharply dressed, his tie loosened after a long day of travel. His car had broken down on the highway, and with no other inns in sight, the faded neon glow of the old hotel was a reluctant salvation. He carried only a leather briefcase, its edges worn from years of constant use. To him, the hotel was nothing more than a place to rest his head until morning. But fate had other plans. At the front desk, the clerk hesitated. The guest register was nearly empty that night. Yet when the businessman requested a quiet room away from the lobby, the clerk's hand froze. He glanced nervously at the brass key that hung heavy on its hook. Room 6A. It was the only one that matched the man's request. For a long moment, he considered lying, offering another excuse about plumbing or renovations, but the businessman was insistent, impatient, his tone curt. "I don't care which room it is, just give me the key." With trembling fingers, the clerk slid the tarnished brass key across the desk. The numbers 6A were etched into it, dulled by time, but still sharp enough to send a chill through anyone who dared to read them. The businessman chuckled, mistaking the clerk's hesitation for superstition. "I'll be fine," he said with a dismissive wave, pocketing the key before hauling his briefcase toward the elevator. The ride up was slow, the elevator groaning with each floor. The sixth floor was colder than the rest of the building, the air heavy and stale. As he walked down the dim corridor, his footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the walls themselves were listening. At the very end stood the door to 6A, its brass knob gleaming faintly under the weak light bulb above. Inside, the room was ordinary at first glance. A neatly made bed, a small nightstand with a lamp that flickered every so often, a desk with an old, disconnected landline phone resting quietly on it. But the air felt wrong to cold, too heavy, as though the room were occupied by more than just him. He shrugged it off. "Haunted hotels," he muttered under his breath, smirking as he loosened his tie. "Makes for good stories." He poured himself a drink from the minibar, sat at the desk, and opened his briefcase to review papers he would never finish. By midnight, the unease had begun to creep in. The lamp flickered more violently, the silence pressing against his ears until it felt suffocating. He swore he heard faint footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside his door. But when he checked, the corridor was empty, stretching long and lifeless. Shaking his head, he returned to the bed. He told himself it was just exhaustion, the tricks of a tired mind. Yet deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. The room seemed to breathe with him, as though something hidden in the shadows waited patiently for him to close his eyes. Still, he forced himself to lie down, unaware that the real nightmare was yet to come. Because at precisely 3:12 a.m., the phone began to ring. The room had been oppressively silent for hours, the kind of silence that weighed heavy on the chest, broken only by the occasional flicker of the bedside lamp. The businessman had drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, his body restless on the mattress as if sensing an unseen presence hovering in the dark. Outside, the the storm had subsided, leaving behind only the sound of dripping rain against the cracked window pane. Then it came. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the stillness was shattered by the piercing ring of the phone. The sound wasn't the tinny chime of a modern cell phone, it was sharp, metallic, and old, the unmistakable cry of a rotary The businessman bolted upright, his heart hammering, eyes darting to the nightstand. His cell phone lay silent. The sound was coming from the disconnected hotel phone that sat on the desk in the corner. For a moment, he froze. Logic battled terror in his mind. He had seen with his own eyes that the phone had no working line, no connection to the outside world. And yet, it rang. The sound echoed unnaturally, filling the room with dread. Against every instinct, he got up, his bare feet cold on the carpet. The ringing grew louder as he approached, almost impatient, vibrating through the air like a demand. His hand trembled as he reached for the receiver. The moment he touched it, the ringing stopped. Silence fell so thick it felt suffocating. Then came the sound of sticlo, buzzing, like wind rushing through broken wires. He pressed the receiver to his ear, his voice unsteady. "Hello?" At first, there was nothing, just the endless hiss. He nearly hung up when he heard it. A woman's voice, soft, fragile, trembling. "Please, don't let them in." His blood ran cold. "Who is this?" he whispered, his throat tightening. "What do you mean? Don't let who in?" The voice repeated, weaker this time, more desperate. "Please, don't let them in." Each word cracked with fear, as though she was speaking from the edge of death. His hand shook so violently he almost dropped the phone. His instinct screamed at him to hang up, but something deeper compelled him to listen. "Listen. Who are you? Where are you calling from?" For several seconds, there was only static. Then, the voice returned, but it was no longer the same. It was deeper now, distorted, echoing unnaturally, as if spoken by many mouths at once. The tone was cruel, mocking. "It's too late." The businessman's knees buckled, his breath catching in his throat. He dropped the receiver, and it clattered to the floor. Yet the phone continued to ring, vibrating violently across the carpet as though alive. He backed away, pressing himself against the wall, eyes fixed on the receiver swinging back and forth like a pendulum. The ringing grew louder, impossibly loud, filling every corner of the room. Covering his ears did nothing. The sound was inside his skull, drilling into his thoughts. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and move, creeping closer with each chime. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the ringing stopped. The room was silent again. Too silent. He dared not breathe, his entire body frozen in fear. The phone lay still on the carpet, the receiver twisted to face upward, as though inviting him to pick it up again. But he didn't. He couldn't. What he didn't know was that by answering the call, by hearing those words, he had already sealed his fate. Morning came quietly to the old hotel, the weak sunlight filtering through broken blinds and dusty windows. On most days, the 6th floor was lifeless, eerily still, as if the air itself refused to move. But on this particular morning, something was wrong, more wrong than usual. The housekeeper, a tired woman who had worked there for decades, wheeled her cart down the corridor. Her footsteps echoed softly, and as she approached room 6A, she noticed the door was not fully shut. It stood slightly ajar, as if waiting. Her chest tightened. No one had checked out from that room, at least, not officially. With trembling hands, she knocked. "Housekeeping," she called, a voice barely more than a whisper. Silence. She pushed the door open. Inside, the room was unnervingly pristine. The bed was neatly made, the sheets untouched, smooth and undisturbed, as though no one had slept in it. On the nightstand, the lamp still flickered weakly, the bulb humming with static energy. The businessman's leather briefcase rested on the desk, closed and locked, while his cell phone lay cracked on the carpet, its last logged call frozen at 3:12 a.m. But the room was empty, completely, utterly empty. That the housekeeper felt her skin prickle. She knew this story too well. It wasn't the first time. Guests had vanished before quietly, without explanation, leaving behind their belongings, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Management never reported these disappearances. They would quietly collect the luggage, store it away in the basement, and act as though nothing had happened. She backed out quickly, her heart pounding, leaving the room exactly as she found it. Later that morning, when the front desk clerk came to retrieve the businessman's belongings, he refused to step inside. He lingered at the doorway, his face pale, muttering under his breath, "Another one." The incident was never filed, never documented. By the end of the day, the man's name was erased from the guest register. The room was locked again, sealed with silence, as though it had been waiting for its next victim all along. But the whispers spread among the staff. Some said they saw a tall figure in a suit, reflected briefly in the cracked hallway mirror that morning. Standing behind them, though, the corridor was empty. Others swore they heard a faint phone ringing from inside 6A, even though the door was locked. The sound muffled yet sharp enough to rattle their bones. The businessman's fate remained a mystery, just another missing soul claimed by the cursed room. And yet, there was a dreadful certainty among those who worked there. Whatever called from inside that room had claimed him completely. There was no escape, no trace, no chance of return. The room had taken him, and now it was waiting again. The hotel should have been buzzing with rumors, shaken by yet another disappearance. But instead, it sank into an unnatural silence. The management pretended nothing had happened, as though the businessman had never checked in. His name was erased from the register. His belongings quietly taken away to the basement storage, where suitcases from other missing guests collected dust. The police were never called. There were no reports filed. In this place, silence was the only policy. But silence can be louder than words. The staff knew. The housekeepers whispered among themselves in the laundry room, lowering their voices to nothing more than a hiss, terrified that the walls themselves might be listening. The night clerk kept his eyes fixed on his desk, refusing to glance at the row of brass keys behind him, where 6A still hung, cold and heavy. The handyman refused to work on the 6th floor, claiming that every time he replaced a light bulb outside 6A, it would flicker out again within minutes. Guests felt it too. They spoke in nervous tones about the suffocating stillness of the hallways, the strange drafts of icy air, and the sensation of being watched whenever they passed the 6th floor. Some said they saw shadows moving behind the locked door of 6A, shifting like figures pacing inside. Others described hearing faint sobs leaking through the cracks of the door, the sound of a woman crying desperately, as though trapped in eternal sorrow. One guest, a college student passing through town, later claimed he saw her. He swore he glimpsed a pale woman in a torn dress, standing at the end of the hallway, clutching an old-fashioned phone receiver in her hand. Her lips moved, mouthing words he couldn't hear, until she slowly turned her hollow eyes toward him. Terrified, he bolted back to his room and checked out at dawn, shaking too badly to sign the papers. The owners dismissed it all as ghost stories, warning staff not to scare the customers. But even they could not deny the unease that had rooted itself in the building. At night, when the corridors fell still, they too heard the faint ringing drifting through the floors. Room 6A remained locked, but the silence surrounding it was not peace. It was dread, a heavy, suffocating silence that swallowed sound and memory, as if the hotel itself was conspiring to hide the truth. And yet, no matter how hard they tried to bury it, the legend of Room 6A grew stronger with every unanswered call, because silence, in places like this, is never empty. It is filled with whispers. It is filled with waiting. The silence that wrapped itself around Room 6A should have suffocated its story, burying it deep within the walls of the decaying hotel. But legends have a way of slipping through cracks, carried by whispers that refuse to die. What began as hushed conversations between housekeepers and night clerks soon spread into town, until every local diner, every late-night bar, seemed to echo with the same tale: the ringing phone, the missing guests, the woman's trembling voice that warned of something unseen. Truck drivers passing through town swapped stories of the haunted floor. College students dared each other to spend a night in the cursed hotel, filming shaky videos of the hallways that sometimes captured faint, inexplicable sounds. Paranormal enthusiasts arrived with cameras and recorders, convinced they would be the ones to document the truth. Some of them left with faces pale and eyes hollow, refusing to say what they had experienced. Others never left at all. Online, the legend spread even further. Forums dedicated to haunted locations began buzzing with threads titled "Room 6A calls you at 3 a.m. and the last call from the hotel that shouldn't exist." Users claimed they had stayed in the hotel years ago and had heard the ringing themselves. Some swore they received phantom calls even after leaving, as though the curse had followed them home. Grainy audio clips surfaced online, recordings of static mixed with faint sobbing or distorted laughter, though skeptics dismissed them as hoaxes. Still, the curiosity grew. The more people tried to investigate, the more dangerous it became. A local journalist once attempted to spend the night in 6A after bribing the front desk. His article was never published. He was found days later in another town, disoriented, muttering incoherently about voices and shadows waiting on the other side of the line. He never returned to his work. For thrill-seekers, Room 6A became a prize, a badge of honor for those who craved proof of the paranormal. But for the locals, it was a curse they could never escape. Parents warned their children never to go near the old hotel. Taxi drivers refused to drop anyone off at its doors after sunset. Even delivery workers avoided its address, leaving packages on the curb rather than stepping inside. And still, the phone rang every night, like clockwork. It rang at 3 a.m. Some said the ringing could be heard from the street outside, echoing faintly from the 6th-floor windows. Others claimed the call reached farther than the hotel walls, bleeding through phone lines in the town itself. A handful of residents swore they had answered their home phones in the middle of the night, only to hear the same fragile voice whisper, "Don't let them in." The legend of Room 6A was no longer just a story about a missing woman or a cursed hotel room. It had become a myth that grew with every retelling, a living nightmare that drew the curious and the reckless like moths to flame. But legends, like fires, consumed those who get too close. And the truth about Room 6A was far more dangerous than any ghost story, because behind every whisper, every ring, every chilling call, something was still waiting for its next victim. To this day, the 6th floor of the hotel remains locked in a kind of eternal twilight. The curtains never open, the lights always seem dim, and the air is forever cold. Guests who are foolish enough to linger there past midnight speak of a tension that grows heavier with each passing minute, as though the building itself is holding its breath. The closer it gets to 3 a.m., the more the silence thickens until the faint, shrill sound of a phone begins to pierce it. It starts softly, almost delicate, like the distant ringing of an old rotary phone echoing from down the hall. But with every second, the ringing grows louder, sharper, more insistent. Those who have heard it describe the sound as unnatural, vibrating not only through the walls but inside their very bones, shaking the air with a presence that cannot be ignored. And then, for the unlucky few who dare to answer, whether through their cell phone or by some terrible compulsion to pick up the ancient receiver in Room 6A, they hear her, the woman's voice, fragile, broken, caught between sobs and whispers. "Please, don't let them in." Sometimes she repeats it over and over, her desperation rising with each plea until her voice splinters into static. Other times, she speaks directly, calling the listener by name, as though she already knows who they are. More than one guest has claimed she described what they were wearing, what they were doing, even secrets no one else should have known. But the true terror lies in what follows, because those who stay on the line too long report a shift, her voice twisting, lowering, becoming distorted and inhuman. The whispers fade, replaced by guttural echoes, as though dozens of voices are speaking at once through the same line. And then, with a finality that drains all hope, comes the message: it's too late. The call always ends in silence, and by morning, the guest is gone. No one knows what them refers to. Some say it is a group of shadowed figures seen creeping beneath the door of 6A. Others believe it is the embodiment of death itself, reaching through the veil to claim another victim. Paranormal investigators who tried to stay past the warning have vanished entirely, their cameras and equipment found abandoned, still recording empty rooms and endless static. The locals warned travelers never to answer a phone after midnight in that hotel, never to walk the 6th floor, and above all, never to step inside Room 6A, because the phone is still there, waiting, and it will ring again. Some say if you are walking that hall at the wrong time, you will hear the faint echo of a phone ringing in the distance. If you are foolish enough to answer, you will join the others who disappeared, your last words recorded not in memory, but in whispers that bleed through the wires of a phone that should no longer exist. The final warning remains the same, passed from the lips of the vanished woman, echoing through time, across dead wires and cursed walls: don't let them in.